Welcome to Stationers' Hall and to a very special evening. Not only is this our first in-person archive evening since 2019, but it's also our first company hybrid event. So welcome to all those who are joining us live via video link, and everyone please be aware that this event is being recorded. It's also a special evening for another reason. This year is the 350th anniversary of the reopening of our beautiful hall after the previous one was burnt down in the Great Fire of London. And I was very keen, therefore, as Master, that this first archive evening back in the hall after its closure for redevelopment should focus on this anniversary. And I'm delighted that the Library and Archive Committee has risen magnificently to the challenge and organised the fascinating exhibition and panel discussion we have before us tonight. We're very grateful to the generosity of the company members who designed, provided the paper and arranged for the printing of the timeline you'll all have a copy of. So a big thank you to Andrew Dicker, Justin Hobson and Jim Vaughan. This evening's focus on the history and the shaping of the hall in 1670 to 73, on the aftermath of the Blitz in 1940, and the opening of the Tocquefield Centre in 2018 has lessons for us all after our own recent rebuilding. And this is because Stationers' Hall is not just about past history, but history that's still being written. And we can all be part of this living history of Stationers' Hall with a new initiative that offers everyone here the opportunity to be part of the Stationers' Archive of the future. We've recently launched a Sponsor a Brick campaign as we need to finish paying for the work that's been carried out to make our premises accessible, sustainable and flexible, and also, and very importantly, secure the hall for future generations. The campaign seeks to raise money for the Stationers' Hall charity, and those sponsoring a brick will have their name or the name of whomever they choose to dedicate the brick to inscribed in a leather book to be kept in the hall forever. And the suggested donation is £100 a brick, and you can sponsor as many bricks as you like. Our archivist, Dr. Ruth Frendo, tells me that the earliest date we can prove for material in our archive is 1557. So our sponsor book will be part of records stretching back for nearly 5 centuries. And it's an opportunity for everyone to have a direct connection to the living history of our hall, and their name or the name of a loved one to be part of Stationers' heritage. If any of you are interested in sponsoring a brick, you'll find leaflets about it on your seat and around the building. And if you're a guest, do ask one of us as Stationers about it afterwards. Now, though, it's time for me to hand over to Chair of the Library and Archive Committee, Court Assistant Carol Tullow, and get tonight's event underway. Thank you.
Good evening, everybody. And when we first, as a group, sat down, a group of wonderful members and experts, to look at a theme for the 350th anniversary of this wonderful hall, we felt this is a real opportunity to unearth some perhaps hidden stories around certain key events and key people who not all of us are familiar with. We're very familiar with the names of the masters on the boards, but a lot of people contributed to this amazing hall that we're sitting in tonight. So we want to explore some of these stories, and our timeline tonight is the starting point. And I was really pleased to see a few of our printer paper members stroking it, because it really does feel really very beautiful. And I just felt that so often we say print is dead, and it isn't. This is a beautiful memento. As the Master said, this also will be part of our archive for the future. And you'll notice that it has a QR code on the front. It does work with your phone. That will link directly to the web pages, where each of the images, either by the date or by the number, you can click on those images and you'll get some more expanded text. Now, we're not going to talk about each and every image in the timeline. They're illustrative, and just show the 350-year time span of this period of history from the rebuilding and opening of the hall after the Fire of London. But do take the opportunity, if you get your interest is whetted by any of the stories or the discussion you hear tonight, to go and have a look at that. So now I'm going to ask each of our panel, carefully selected panel, to introduce themselves and their connection with the company. You probably know everybody on the stage, but not all of you will. So I'll start, and then we'll just go down the table. So I am a court assistant and chair of the Library and Archive Committee since last autumn. And nobody tells you that this is the first thing that you have to organise. And it's quite an event. And I couldn't have done it without the help of people on this panel and also a number of the people sitting in the audience. Julian.
My name is Julian Venables, and I'm here via an ancestral link. My great-great-grandfather was the Lord Mayor of London in 1826, Sir William Venables. His name's painted on the board. And a second cousin told me to come and have a look at Stationers' Hall in 2017. So I came along and had a look around and joined at the beginning of 2018, and I've just become a liveryman. I am an astrologer, and I'm going to tell you tonight about astrology and the symbolism of astrology in this hall, because it was very popular here many centuries ago.
Thank you.
I'm Margaret Wills. I'm a liveryman of the Stationers, actually I'm the chairman of the Hall and Heritage Committee, but tomorrow I shall step down after the last meeting. So this is the eve of that honour. I have written books about particularly about this area. I published a book last year on St Paul's Churchyard. So this is a particular interest in this area for me.
Paul Wilson, Underwarden, formerly chairman of Library and Archives Committee, which was one of my dream jobs. More recently responsible for organising the team that oversaw the recent remodelling of the company's premises here.
Thank you, David.
I'm David Pearson. I was a librarian by profession. I managed libraries and collections around London for most of my career. I retired about 6 years ago as Director of Culture, Heritage and Libraries for the City of London Corporation. And it was when I came to work for the corporation that I joined the company and became a liveryman, because I was so acutely aware of the historic links between the city corporation and the livery companies, and I was very keen to develop an association. And I am currently the honorary librarian for the company.
And I'm Ruth Frendo. I'm the archivist here at the Stationers' Company. And I do hope I'll be seeing some of you in the archive. We are open to the public. We're freely accessible. And basically it is by appointment only, because I'm the only person who works in the archive. So you need to make sure that I'm actually here. But as I said, looking forward to welcoming you to the archive soon.
So you've met our panel, and we're all going to talk, everyone's going to talk about their particular area of specialism, but it is a panel, and we do hope very much that we will have quite some interplay between the panel members. And obviously we'll also have room for questions at the end, and we'll also be able to take questions from anybody who's live streaming the event tonight. I'm going to start with Paul. So Paul, can you take us back to those momentous days, 2nd to the 6th of September, the Great Fire, changed Stationers' history, and the hall we're sitting in tonight? Can you take us back and paint the picture of what happened then?
Well, I think we've got a few slides, but I'll just kick off by saying the devastation for the Stationers' Company was immense. It wasn't just the loss of the hall. The company also lost warehouses. It lost the English stock, which was in the crypt of St Paul's. and it lost other locations which were revenue raising. So things like the Feathers Tavern in St. Paul's Churchyard, and tenements which now occupy the site of the, which would have then occupied the site of the club quarters building over there. So there was a complete meltdown of company revenues at the time, and this no doubt affected lots of people because they would have lost their own personal stock, their inventories, in some cases their shops would have been burnt down. And essentially it was a complete body blow to the company, and the cost of rebuilding not just the hall, but things like houses that the company owned, warehouses, pub and so on, were a major problem. How were they going to raise that money? So if I just sort of roll on now, I mean, the first thing the Stationers' Company has traditionally done for over 400 years, whenever it's confronted by a challenge, is form a committee, which quite often must have some subcommittees. So you cannot possibly cope with the problem unless you do this. And this is this extract here is one of a number that are in our archives, and it's the list of the Committee for Building as at 1669. I think that the example set out by Ruth in the other room may be from a different group, but this committee continued to meet for some years. So members of the committee dropped in and out. Some died, some for some reason had other things to get on with. Some people were promoted into the court and they joined this committee. The one person who seems to have been pretty well consistent is the person at the top, who is Sir Thomas Davies, who's master of this company twice, went on to be Lord Mayor, and was must have been a really dynamic character, because his book-selling business would have been impacted, I think, but nevertheless, he was responsible for marshalling all of the people on the court to regain the money, to obtain the revenues, to start the rebuilding, and to oversee the lot. And in fact, it wasn't just here that he played a significant role, because the monument that we all know in the city that commemorates the Great Fire and that was built in the late 17th century names the 7 Lord Mayors, from the one who began the process of building the monument to the one who finished it. And Thomas Davies was the one who finished it. He's mentioned in Pepys' diary. He must have been a bit of a character, because there's a good story that as master, you're supposed to donate 2 venison bucks for a feast. Well, the company had to keep chasing him to get these venison bucks from him. He simply, I don't know, was he hard up? Was he just a bit sloppy about these sort of things? I don't know. But on the other hand, he did leave to the company 2 fantastic silver cups, and they're actually in the cabinet over here, which you might be able to see after we've finished. Wonderful, tall, standing silver cups. So a very dynamic character. And other personnel on this court, on this team, were rather interesting in their own right. So on the right-hand column at the top, you've got Crook, and that's Andrew Crook, who was the publisher of Hobbes and Leviathan. And Crook left to the company a silver cup that's in the bottom right-hand chiffonier. So very generous, and we've had these items for 350 years. They remain our connection to the past. There are other people there. It seemed to be consistently quite a high-powered group of people who were selected for this. Many of them went on to be master. Some of them were King's printer for Ireland or King's printer for Scotland. And we actually owned a printing operation in Edinburgh at one stage, but didn't hold onto it for very long. A further member of the committee was chap called Maycock, who specialized in almanacs, which of course would be Julian's area of interest. And bottom right of that column of names is Samuel Mern, and David will speak about Mern. So if I just scamper on to the next slide, this is quite an important page in the archives, which tells which gives the remit to this committee what they've got to do. They've got to meet once a week, not once a month like the Hall Project Executive Committee met. They had to meet once a week. They had to crack on to get this business finished, because they say the foundations have been up and the first floor have been up for 2 years. But they're only covered in wood and lath, and it's already in decay. So the instructions are get on and get this thing sorted and done. And by the way, you have to call in anybody who owes any money to the company, whatever that is, call them in, get that money and get the job completed. So it's a pretty sort of dynamic, driving, forceful edict from the court. Let's get on and crack this. And then we have instructions that here is what we call, the subcommittees emerging out of this committee. It's just not a proper committee unless it has loads of subcommittees. And here this group are instructed to go and survey the ground on which the hall is going to be built. Well, they're not professional surveyors. We've got one who will appear in this exercise, but they've got to get out and take a look at it and see what can be done and what orientation are they going to build on. So if we could have the next one, please, Lucy. I now have to remind myself. Now, I think this one relates to a need to form yet another subcommittee who will go out and negotiate with people who owned houses. Now, at one point in the archives, there's a reference to houses belonging to the company which have been burnt down in Billingsgate. So they say the former tenants of these houses want to negotiate with the company about the possibility of rebuilding these houses. So this subcommittee has to go out and renegotiate the terms. We don't know much about the terms. We don't know who was going to cover what cost. But if I remember rightly, there is a key moment towards the end where it says the Beadle will be a member of this committee. Now, nothing's changed. In 350 years, the Hall Project Executive Committee, which is in the throes of wrapping up the project here, had on it just about throughout our hall manager, our Beadle. So this points us in one direction, and that is that whilst the means by which these buildings are constructed has changed beyond all recognition, certain things in the way the company tackles problems have been consistent, not just for 350 years, but really for 400 at least. Now, this item is on display in, I think, the first case in the other room. And this is the summing up of all the costs for the wood paneling that you see around you here. So these would be, I think, the bills submitted by Stephen College, the famous Protestant joiner whose own life was quite dramatic. He was a difficult character, and eventually ended up being executed for something like treason, I suppose. It was treason. Margaret's confirmed that. But we had a look at this sum, £731. So this bears no resemblance to any figure today if you just apply inflation. But our archivist very cleverly used her modern telephone to determine that the National Archives tells us £731 will buy you back then 115 horses. So you could just imagine that College did a very nice bit of business, and he was still billing the company, I think, into about into about 1675. Lucy? Now, this is quite interesting. This item, and this is the last one I promise, comes from something called the Liber Pauperibus. In other words, the paupers or the alms book. And it lists what people were paid either as a charity donation or in that first group, the very top group, I suppose it must be about 16, 18 entries. They were described as pensioners. And if you look back through the paupers book, the earlier entries, and they were given this money quarterly, they were given £1 every quarter. Now, here's the first entry after the Great Fire, and it's 10 shillings. So it tells us that the income, the revenues into the company had been hit so badly across all those areas that I described, that they had no option but to cut in half the pension that members of the company got at that time. So I think there, what we've described is how they went about tackling this set of problems, the sort of sums of money that they were forced to expend on it, and finally the impact on other areas of the company's activity, like the foundational, like charity and pensions. So I think that's.
Well, you touched on the role of the beadle being equally important now. Any other parallels or lessons that we can learn from then that we put into practice over the last couple of years?
Well, I think, yeah, the first thing I said about the, the response is always to form a committee, and the committee must have subcommittees. I think, trying to draw any comparison between construction methods then and now is instructive in itself. In this whole exercise and on the list of expenditure on the paneling, the wood paneling, it was signed off by Laban, who was the surveyor or principal architect, really. And you'll see his drawings in the exhibition next door. Laban seems to have been the only surveyor who was involved in this exercise throughout the whole duration. But during the recent remodeling, we've had 6 different architects on this operation, and ours lasted a couple of years. Theirs lasted longer, and they only had one chap working on it.
Interesting, really interesting. So we're right in the heart of the 17th century. I'm going to go to Julian next, because we know about the importance of astrology and astrological publishing through the English Stock Company to this company. I mean, much of its wealth was built and it was underpinned by those 17th century beliefs. But how do we see that reflected here in the hall, in its redesign on the rebuild? What's significant about that time and this site?
Thank you, Carol. I think firstly, a little overview of what 17th century belief was actually like and how people used to think around this time. Astrology most definitely played a part in the building of the 1673 hall. At that time, Plato and Aristotle's theory was still the primary belief system, that the earth was at the center, still and unmoving, around which were 7 interlocking crystalline spheres of light, making up the celestial 7 heavens above. Via this geocentric viewpoint, humanity found its link to God, the divine creator at the very center of being, through perceiving layers of consciousness emanating outwards, the 7 visible planets imagined as rotating spheres. Medieval and Renaissance life was thus lived at the center of a cosmic bubble of creation. And for stationers, we have a familiar phrase, vita humana bulla est, life is but a bubble. It is very likely that Richard Johnson, who died 228 years ago, was aware of the changing viewpoint of the world as the scientific view took hold and left a legacy for the annual St. Bride's service to remind us of the original geocentric view. In the 17th century, most people who could read owned two books, a Bible and an almanac, to keep close to God by observing the movements of the heavens, day to day, month to month, and season to season. The company was able to create great wealth from publishing almanacs because a new one was needed by everybody annually. Not only did these give celestial advice and insights, but also horticultural information, growing seasons and lunar phases. As the scientific viewpoint took over from the early 18th century onwards, materialistic, reductionist, and objectivist viewpoints began to dominate as the natural wonders of creation were picked apart and gradually discarded. Almanacs turned into desk diaries and daily newspapers. And the sacred knowledge of the planets as mirroring life on Earth was overrun by a new understanding of the world, which was mostly disenchanted. Much of the mystical qualities of God found in nature were explained away by rationalism. Now, in the 21st century, many are calling for a return to spiritual values through care of the environment, sustainability, and management of natural resources. It is also, or is it also a time for a return to the use of astrology as the ancient guiding system and a more geocentric approach? So that's a little bit about 17th century belief. But now let's look at how astrology informs many features of this great building we are so fortunate to enjoy. I'm going to take your attention now to the exterior of the Great Hall. When you arrive here each time and you walk into the courtyard outside, I want you to pay attention to what is above these four windows. And the first slide, please, thank you very much, is that is the first slide. So what we're going to be looking at here is the idea of the external putti who are with zodiac signs. Okay, so if you can see that there, that's the first one, which is above this window here. So there's a putti above this window in a roundel, and beside it, you can see the putti, there's a figure of a ram. I don't know if you can see that there, top left, top right of the picture. There's a picture of a ram. With the next one, this window here, there. Next slide, please. Thank you. So you can see there a putti holding a scythe, but with the crab just in front of its face there. That's Cancer the crab. That's the summer solstice. I'll talk about them more in a minute, the seasons. Then we have the middle window, which is a griffin, which is not, there's no slide for that, but that's griffins with a cup. The next window, which is this one here, is, next slide, yep, you can see the putti with a pair of scales, which is Libra. And then the last putti, which is actually in a covered up window, was the Capricorn. And if you look at that one, you'll see there's a goat with the putti who is putting on a pair of ice skates. I'll explain that in a minute. Firstly, let me tell you a bit about putti. So in the ancient classical world, they are physical manifestations of invisible essences, and they were believed to influence human lives. They reflect both the Roman genius spirit and the Greek's daimon, the two types of messenger spirit, being halfway between the human and the divine. Mostly depicted as winged infants, they represent fertility, abundance, the spirit of the fruit of life, and wild revelry. We find their form in various places, including the Greek Eros and the Roman Amor or Cupid, the god of love and companion of Aphrodite or Venus. They are the messengers of the heavens, bringing peace, prosperity, mirth, and leisure. The examples on our hall do not have wings, possibly indicating that their spirit is grounded within the structure. Thus, the profusion of putti in the high Baroque architecture of the 17th century represent the omnipresence of God. And here at Stationers' Hall, we have putti clearly depicted with 4 specific signs of the zodiac, suggesting astrology and the understanding of the stars' links to the divine and the heavens above. Each zodiac sign marks the beginning of a season. So Aries, the ram, this window, marks the vernal equinox, the spring equinox, Cancer, the crab, for the summer solstice, the third, Libra, the scales, for the autumn equinox, and Capricorn, the goat, for winter. Now, a little bit more on the idea of how the sun creates the seasons is if you walk through Temple Bar and into Paternoster Square, you can see the sundial on the far wall up high. You can see a sundial. It's a modern sculpture, but it's there. If you walk through Temple Bar, it's straight ahead and up ahead. The crossing point of the figure of 8 in that sculpture is the spring and autumn equinox, which is the equal day and night. The top of the short loop is the winter solstice. The bottom loop is the summer solstice. And if you spend some time to look at that, you'll see the months marked out, and you'll understand that the seasons are the points, the vital points of that sculpture. So in spring, we have new life, plants bursting out of the ground, seeds sprouting, and buds appearing on the trees right now. It's, in fact, the sun is in Aries today. It is the beginning of spring. Summer brings an abundance of growth, blossoming, and fruition. In autumn, we harvest, select, and weigh up produce, which is Libra, the scales. Winter brings hard frozen ground and long cold nights before the eventual return of the light and the warmth. The principle of astrology is that the movement of the planets in the heavens above is reflected like a mirror on the earth below. Primarily, one also sees this growth within oneself. The putti carry the fruits of the seasons. If you go through the slides again, you can see they all have like cornucopias of plenty in each round, except for the winter putti, who is putting on ice skates, suggesting that the fun was to be had by going to one of the ice fairs held on the River Thames during the winter. The spiritual symbolic meaning of putti and the zodiac signs depicted together is that we have the combination of the messenger spirits of revelry and love depicted on the exterior of the Great Hall, indicating how the celebration of life, of the love of all good things, as found in astrology, could have been found within this hall. In the 17th century and in Abergavenny House before the fire, there would have been astrologers as members and discussions of the influence of the planets. They would have discussed it over the dinners consistently because it was the ancient belief system. Much of the writing of almanacs would have occurred in this very hall. The putti and zodiac symbolism together indicates that inside, the spiritual connection to the heavens could be felt, experienced, and enjoyed. There is something about the combination of putti with the zodiac signs that suggests the putti are going beyond mere ornamentation and static embellishment. These delightful little figures show the innocence of childhood and in true symbolic fashion are the key for the observer to see its way to connect to the divine and to the creator. Now let's look at the slide, please, of the lion's face. Yep, thank you. This is the lion's face roundel. Above the blue doors, you'll find this in the courtyard outside. It is a lion's face in the sun's beams. The lion in zodiac symbology represents the sun, which is the light giver, the bringer of warmth and the essence of life as a growth cycle. The Leo month runs from July the 21st to August the 22nd and tends to be the warmest when the fruit on the vine ripens, ready to be harvested. So we see in this image a lion's face set inside flower petals to indicate growth and flourishing. The blue doors of the hall face in the same direction and relatively close in position to Ludgate, the western entrance to the city. In the summer months, there is a large amount of sunshine along Fleet Street from the west, illuminating St. Paul's in a golden glow. The alignment of the lion's face to the west indicates the outpouring of this light. When the blue doors are opened, the stationers in their livery reflect it as they walk westwards into the city towards St. Paul's. This is a symbolic example of the proud and glorious Leo or the royal or the sun symbolism found in the company's traditional events. And now to come to the interior of the hall and to draw your attention to the Caxton window, which is the most glorious piece of stained glass. Now, next time you look at the Caxton window, take a little while to notice a striking bit of sun lion symbolism concealed in the king's breastplate. Focus on the golden yellow part, and looking at all the markings and shadings, you might start to perceive a hidden lion's face. Also, the interior carved wooden crowns in the hall reflect on the power of royal symbolism. In astrology, the sun, the light giver. And now please to the next slide. I'd also like to mention tonight the astrological symbolism of the Stationers' Company crest. Eagles are astrologically ruled by the planet Jupiter. And in this symbolic picture, you can see the king of the gods. This is an ancient picture of Jupiter. The king of the gods' chariot is being drawn by a pair of eagles. The planet Jupiter is associated in astrology with various rulerships, including publishing, faith, belief, and religion. The King James Bible was drafted in this hall. Education, we have the Stationers' Crowns Woods Academy. Broadcast and wider distribution of knowledge and learning are all under the rulership of Jupiter. So, the flying eagle holding a book in its talons symbolizes Zeus, the king of the gods. In Roman times, Jupiter was called Optimus Maximus. In medieval times, it was called Major Fortuna. And in the Renaissance, it was called the Greater Benefic. A Jupiter symbol brings great blessings to our company. In summary, the hall reflects hidden meanings, typical of the beliefs held in the 17th century when it was built. I hope my talk has awakened some curiosity among members who might start to see this great hall in a new light.
Thank you, Jude. One of the things that those of us who do tours of the hall, and I know there's a number of you in the audience today, is you learn quite a lot about the symbolism. Much of this was completely new to me, but I did know that the eagle is reflected here because it flies highest in the sky, so it's closest to God. And I also know that we've got some other birds in the courtroom, in the plasterwork by the fireplace, and those are ho-ho birds, and they're symbols of good fortune, quite allied to the phoenix. So there's a lot of symbolism that we just don't realize because we just walk past it every day, and it's nice to have it aired slightly for tonight. It may prompt some other questions. I think, Ruth, also, you and I were looking into the stained glass windows, weren't we? Particularly Master Butterworth, who donated the Caxton window, and then Master Waller, who was responsible for some of these other windows. And it really was one-upmanship, I think we agreed, didn't we?
Completely, yes.
Yeah. As to who would donate which window. And that Caxton window took less than a year from the idea of the donation to being fitted. So it is amazing. And now there's a little bit of symbolism with it, which is interesting. But now we've talked about the building and the exterior, the interior of this wonderful hall. Margaret, can you talk to us a little bit about how the hall was used? How has its use developed? Perhaps you could shed a little bit of light on that for us.
So the hall, the hall in general, obviously has different parts, the stock room, etc. But we're now in the dining hall, and feasts were held here throughout the year. This celebration of the company's patron saint, St. John the Evangelist, was marked by a dinner in the hall on the 6th of May. Another from 1684 was a feast in November in celebration of St. Cecilia, who we can see in the window, one of the windows, the patron saint of music. This apparently began with John Blow's "Welcome every guest, welcome to our music's feast." Within 20 years, the music's feast was stopped because it had become too lively an affair. In between these two celebrations came the election or election feast, following the choosing of a new master. Traditionally, the stationer's year began on the Saturday after the feast of St. Peter on 29th of June, when a new master and the Court of Assistants were elected. But by the late 17th century, the feast took place in August. I think probably because it was a dead time of the year. The court, the royal court and the courts of justice were both closing, and the aristocrats had gone off to their country estates. And after all, they were the important customers as far as the stationers were concerned. An invitation to the dinner for 10th of August 1681 it gives an idea of the proceedings. It's rather fascinating. It doesn't look very much, but it tells us quite a lot. The stationers were to meet at 9 in the morning and, gowned and hooded, process to St. Martin within Ludgate to hear a sermon before dining in the hall. Failure to bring hood and gown would result in a fine of 2 shillings, which actually was quite a lot of money in those days. So such fines would go to a fund for the poor stationers, which Paul was mentioning earlier. A reminder of the company's social concerns. Dinner in the 17th century was usually taken at noon. Interestingly, the beadle also invited wives to dine, and a bill of 1686 in the archives for printing specifies 100 tickets for the livery feast plus 30 for court assistants and their wives. The role of women in the company was at this time was quite important. Women could become freemen through patrimony, and the wives of some of the leading stationers could play quite an important part. This all kind of collapsed in the 19th century. The archives are rich in documents which give us the background to these August feasts. A build-up for 1677, which you will see in the exhibition, talks about some of the food. And the key element of the August feast was venison. I was interested by Paul telling us that it was the master who supplied the 2 bucks, but it was the renter wardens who had to go and get them. So the master paid for it, but the renter wardens went and acquired them. And I was wondering whether perhaps we should revive this now with our current renter wardens. They were roasted, well larded with bacon, along with turkeys. A half of a deer was to go into pasties, and an early 17th century recipe for such pasties recommended parboiling the meat in a liquor flavored with herbs such as rosemary and fennel, then marinated in vinegar for 12 hours. It was then put in a coffin, which is a pastry with sweet butter and spices and baked for a further 12 hours. I did actually talk about this a couple of years ago, and somebody was very concerned about these coffins that we were putting the meat in. The bill also mentions umble pies. So umbles were the entrails of the deer. Although we talk about eating humble pie, an act of contrition, recipes of the period suggest quite a rich dish. One talks of mincing the umbles finely, adding cinnamon and ginger and sugar, dates and currants and chopped almonds. They were all baked with fat and again put in a coffin. So meat dominates the list, but there is a reference to vegetables. Savoy sprouts, a forerunner of Brussels sprouts, cabbage, artichokes, and French beans. All these dishes would have been placed on the table at the same time in the style of a Chinese meal today. So this was known as à la française at the time, or perhaps it wasn't known as à la française until it changed at the end of the 18th century when à la Russe came in, which was when different courses were served. Oranges and lemons are also listed, but they would seem to have been used as a garnish. And roses and clove pinks are often mentioned as being used as ornaments for the table and would have been in season in August. The bill has a mention of more flowers and paper and packthread for a fairly modest outlay of 2 shillings and 6pence. These are probably were used as decoration on the linen tablecloths. The bills for other August feasts make mention of the services of a herb woman for considerably larger sums, such as £1.10. This would suggest that the woman brought herbs in bulk, not just as seasoning for the venison and pies, but to strew the hall. I was very interested in this because I've been doing quite a lot of research into when strewing was stopped. Samuel Pepys mentions in his diary talking to Killigrew, who was running one of the theatres, who said that after the fire, when they rebuilt the theatres or they opened the theatres, they stopped strewing the stage because the actors and actresses, of course it would have been actresses by this time, got caught up in their clothes. But institutions such as the Stationers' Company may have strewn herbs for special occasions. And the herbs mentioned are bay, rosemary, and laurel, mixed with rushes that were brought up the Thames on barges and offloaded. The herbs, when trodden on, would emit fresh fragrance. But then also we've got to remember there were fleas and mice. So Artemisia and wormwood would have deterred the fleas, and mint apparently was disliked by mice. Good hint. The drinks to accompany these dishes were beer or wine, and these would have, appalling as it may strike purists, today sugar was added to both of these. Pepys records drinking sugared beer in his diary along with sack. And Sir John Falstaff's favourite tipple, according to Shakespeare, it was so much a matter of course to put sugar in that he was known as Sir John's sack and sugar. The one drink that would not have been used was water. Even small children would have been given small beer. During the Stationers' Feast, toasts were drunk, including the ceremony of the loving cup, which we still do today. That dated back to the idea of the loving cup of one of the Anglo-Saxon kings, King Edward the Martyr, was stabbed in the back while he was drinking. So it's a sort of form of protection. And it's quite an elaborate ceremony, you will remember. And it resembles a stately dance. But the records suggest that stateliness may not have been the abiding characteristic of these feasts. There's a butler's bill, which I think is in the exhibition, tells a sorry tale of losses of linen, glasses, knives, salt, spoons, pitchers and jugs. And the court book for 1695 noted that the victuals should not be carried out of the hall until the end of the meal, suggesting that doggy bags were a custom at the time. So finally, music, of course, was an important part of the celebration. And the musicians not only took part here in the hall, but they would have also been accompanied the stationers on their barge, which the stationers had a barge from the end of the 17th century, which was kept at Lambeth. And they would have accompanied the new mayor and the Lord Mayor's show, which of course was then on the river and not in the streets. So, we still have a picture of the barge. I think it's at the bottom of the Caxton window, we also have the pennant of the Scriveners Company. Most of those barges disappeared in the 19th century.
Thank you. Margaret, what about the garden? Was that always quite important? Do you think?
The garden?
Yes, the garden.
I think the garden would have been fairly plain at the time. We have pictures of it from almanacs, and it looks very much sort of just like sort of a space with some a few beds. It's not like the Draper's garden. The Draper's garden was rather elaborate, but we were never as rich as the Drapers. And of course, the plane tree, which is such an important element of the garden now, wasn't planted until the 19th century. Although the garden was used, of course, for the ashes from the kitchens, which not only supplied the feasts, but it also would have burnt the naughty books, seditious and heretical books, which was part of the stationer's remit to do. And then they were buried, the ashes would have been put in the garden.
Yes, yes, yes. We should also remember that obviously this whole area was razed to the ground by the fire. But the church on our site, abutting our site, St Martin's within Ludgate, wasn't actually rebuilt until much later after our hall. I think it was about 1684. I think.
Was it really?
Yeah, and the story goes that one of the things they were very grateful about was that there was nowhere for the church to meet, and they think that they did actually meet here. Because obviously our hall was already built, but it must have been quite a scene of devastation, I think.
That's very interesting, because actually, as I mentioned, the invitation which I showed, that's 1681.
Yeah.
So I think they processed to the church then, but maybe they processed in here and had a service.
Who knows?
That's
Who knows?
interesting.
Who knows? But I was also very amused to see that the invitation came from the Beadle, just showing the importance of the Beadle. Because of course now our invitations will come from the master, wouldn't they, for any formal occasion. So the Beadle is clearly the person to watch out for at those times.
Then as now.
Yes. So we've heard about the early wealth of the company and the 17th century, where we are positioned this evening. That the wealth came from almanacs and salters and the English Stock Company. We've had a brief mention of one of the key people on that original building committee, Samuel Mearn. And David, you've chosen to take Samuel as an exemplar, haven't you?
Indeed, I have. And if we have my first slide, one of the names on our timeline is that of Samuel Mearn, whose gift of a silver salver to the company is illustrated there. And the salver itself is out on display in the exhibition. I'm sure many of you will have seen it tonight. It's the first time that I've ever seen it. It's a very wonderful and beautiful object, and I suspect I'm not the only person here tonight who may have looked at it in that case and thought just how nice it would look on our dining table at home. But that's an aside. Mearn is one of the company members from the late 17th century who I think is better known than many others of the time, and one of the very few company members of the time who has quite a full entry in the Dictionary of National Biography. But it's almost entirely for his fame as a bookbinder. If I can have my next slide, please. The late 17th century was a time when a lot of very fine binding work was executed by London workshops, and there are those who think that it was the time when London binding was perhaps at its all-time zenith. And there were many craftsmen in London and elsewhere who could produce very fine quality binding work. But Mearn, who was appointed the royal bookbinder in 1660, is the best known of them. And his workshop is famous for producing book bindings like this, using best quality leather to produce very elaborate, highly gilded bindings, painted multicolored leather onlays, very elaborate designs, very beautiful objects. Though he was also responsible, next slide please, for supplying a lot of bindings to the Royal Library, which were rather more simply but very elegantly bound using Charles II's royal cipher of the crown C's back to back, which you can see on those pictures there. And there was a time when pretty much any nice looking Restoration period binding was attributed to Samuel Mearn or said to be in his style. We do now understand that he wasn't at all the only binder in London making this kind of thing, or indeed actually that he was the binder. He was trained as one and he certainly could bind books, but his success came from running a business. And during the 1660s and 70s, he was operating as a publisher and as a bookseller, as well as running a bindery. And lots of the books that are described in catalogues as bound by Samuel Mearn were actually bound by unknown workmen who were employed by him, but who had the skills to produce these kinds of things. It's how the binding trade operated at the time. But Mearn had a much broader range of operation than that, and looking at the company archives around the time of the rebuilding of the hall does illustrate very much just how actively Mearn was involved in the life of the company then, and gives a better sense of the breadth of his book trade activities. He was appointed as a court assistant to the company in 1668 by royal mandate. The king sent a message to the company to say, I want this person, and this person on the court. And of course they complied. And they were a number of leading book trade personnel of the time who had been especially active in seeking out unlicensed presses and in acting in the royal interest. And so from the late 1660s until his death in 1683, he was a very senior player in the company's affairs. And if you look through the meetings of the monthly meetings of the court for the 1670s, he seems to have been present at almost every one. Mearn missed hardly a court meeting through the 1670s up to his death in the early 1680s. He was regularly involved in what were called private court meetings when subcommittees were needed, absolutely speaking to Paul's theme here. And he was a member of that committee that was appointed in 1672 to get on with the rebuilding of the hall, which then met weekly. He was elected under warden in 72. He was upper warden in 1676. He became master in 1679. And he also did a second stint as master in 1682 when Thomas Vere died in office. And Mearn himself sadly then went on to follow in that pattern, and he too died in office as master in 1683. So next slide, please. He was under warden in 1674 when William Leybourne compiled his survey of company property, which you see out in the cases next door. And so Mearn's name is one of the ones that is on the title page of that, right at the very bottom, as under warden. Next slide, please. His name regularly features in the various leases and property transfer deeds of the 1670s, when the company was confirming its holdings after the fire. The fire burnt everything down in London, and everybody who owned everything had to kind of reclaim their property and reassert it through the fire court system that was set up by the city corporation at the time. And this is the main deed for the the ownership or the reaffirming of the ownership of the hall itself and for the ground on which what in the document is called Pembroke's Inn stood, because the hall here was Abergavenny House from the early 17th century when the company took it over. And before that, it was known as Pembroke's Inn because it stood on a site that was owned by the Earl of Pembroke. Next slide, please. Mern was, unsurprisingly, a partner in the English stock, which was the great money spinning arm of the company's activities. And he was appointed one of the stock keepers in 1675. And Paul Wilson kindly pointed out to me, my next slide, a very lengthy list of copyrights, which Mern acquired in 1673, which illustrates the extent of his book-selling business, the very long list of books which Mern owned a stake in the publishing of and generated income from. He was appointed in 1675 not only bookbinder to the king, but also bookseller and stationer to the king. So he pretty much had the book trade sewn up from the 1670s. But again, going back to a theme which has come up in several of our talks this evening, in 1681, the court voted to suspend his dividends from the English stock because he had failed to provide a dinner, or any explanation as to why he wasn't providing a dinner. But a couple of months later, it was all sorted out and smoothed out, and he promised to provide a venison dinner for the court. Needless to say, a venison dinner. And he died in 1683, and the silver salver that we see next door was actually given to the company by his widow a little time after his death in 1685 as a fitting memento for somebody who was such a senior player and such an important member of the company's affairs. His son Charles Mern, continued to be stationer and binder to the king until 1688, and that was when the Glorious Revolution came in and James II was kicked out and William Orange came into the throne. And all of those kinds of appointments were ended then, and new people came in, and that was kind of the end of the Mern dynasty for royal appointments. What I would like to end with, of course, is a slide of, and here is a Mern workshop binding from the company's library, from our own collections, but alas, we don't have any of those. If any generous liveryman would like to take this opportunity to fill that gap by finding and presenting one, that would, of course, be a very wonderful thing. We'd be very grateful, but I'm not expecting that. But seriously, looking at Mern's involvement with the company does help us to understand, to flesh out his career, not only to understand how involved he must have been with the rebuilding of this hall, which he would have followed kind of every brick by brick kind of thing, but just what an active member of the book trade more generally he was. And our archive evenings have always been about recognizing and celebrating the importance of the company's archives as such a treasure in our documentary heritage, in our national heritage. And I think this is an illustration of that, of the way in which the company's archives can be mined in so many ways to broaden our understanding of the way things worked. So Mern was an important part of that picture, and he would have recognized and valued, I think, where we are sitting today. That's my piece.
So we've come full circle from seeing Samuel Mern as a member of that crucial building committee to his contribution within the wider company. And it's remarkable, really, that just a century later, one of the images we used on the timeline and that was on display in the exhibition, we use that image number 9, I think it is, to show the London printer and bookseller Thomas Carnan, who challenged successfully the Stationers' Company monopoly on the publication of almanacs by printing his diaries with strikingly similar content. And the court as in the court of law, in 1775 ruled in his favour, and he was so pleased with it that he added forever a motto to his imprint, saying that he was the one who, quote, dispossessed the Stationers' Company of the exclusive privilege of printing almanacs, which they had unjustly monopolised for 170 years. So, you know, some things just don't change.
And he drove his coach and horses round the Stationers' Company.
Did he?
To the hall, just to prove his point.
Oh, I think I would have liked to have met Thomas Carnan. He was clearly a showman, wasn't he? Julian, is there anything from what David said you wanted to add about the astrology of almanacs? Is there anything that occurred to you?
Well, almanacs were the day-to-day, week-to-week, month-to-month review of how to be at one with the world. So they worked very well with religious texts back in the day, 300 years ago. And so it was also like everything could be seen, could have a meaning through understanding the movement of the planets. So not only the moon movements, but you'd have weather predictions, oh, it's going to rain today, or it's windy, and this would all be put down to the planets. But also, a lot of the almanacs have what's called the Melethesia image of a man with the 12 zodiac signs pointing to different parts of the body. This is all indicative of how deeply astrology was believed to be at work, that within ourselves we are sort of reflections of the planets. So it's a very deep spiritual belief, and it was only when the development of the scientific rationalism that it started to create the difference between the two. So yeah.
And we know that the stockroom gets its name from the English Stock Company. And it always conjures up for me this image of all the sheets of the almanacs would all be brought to the stockroom, and the little jobbing booksellers and printers from all around the area would come in and buy their sheets. And obviously they would sell the basic sheets to your average person. But the reason we have so many beautiful bindings for almanacs is people would buy the sheets, and they would then put these wonderful bindings on them. And it's a shame. We have quite a few almanacs, don't we, Ruth, in the archive?
We do, yes. All quite late bindings.
Yeah.
I'm
Almost
afraid.
all, sadly.
Yes, yeah. But they are, I mean, they're fascinating to read. And the interesting thing about our collection is because it extends so far, you can really see those changes in almanacs that Julian was mentioning, that the shift moves very much from, I suppose, concerns that would have been of a principally agrarian society as well. And then it moves on to reflect things like the growth of empire, the industrialization of Britain. They're actually really interesting to look at as a whole as well. And great advertising as well.
Yes, and they are lovely to hold if you haven't had the opportunity to visit the archive and to actually see them. And I think that I think we forget, don't we, that we don't have an amazingly large collection of historical books here. And David and I were talking earlier this afternoon that if only it had been the sort of style for people to donate their books in the 17th century, we'd have an amazing collection. Although somebody also pointed out that in the strictures of the financial problems in the 1960s, we probably would have sold them all for a song anyway, and they still wouldn't be here. But again, completing the circle, we know, and the lovely story, the first image in the timeline that you will have this evening is the wonderful George Tokefield, the clerk at the time, who saved the records from the fire. But Ruth, can you imagine what it would have been like if we hadn't had that archive? I suppose he might have saved the silver, because we lost all the silver, of course, but he prioritised the registers, didn't he?
Yes, and I think that's quite indicative of how important the archive has always been to the stationers. To an extent that's quite unusual, I think. And certainly when I joined the company, it was one of the things that I was really impressed by, the investment that the company were willing to put into their archive.
Mm.
I guess records have always been quite central to the business of the stationers in a way that possibly it hasn't been for other livery companies. So of course you have the stationers register, which was such a crucial point from which the stationers drew so much power and so much influence over the publishing industry. So in a sense, record making and record keeping is what made the company what it was. So
Yes.
perhaps it's only right that they
Yes. And very modestly, Paul has divined from a court entry that the monies paid out to the monies paid out to some of our pensioners was halved after the fire, which showed financial issues. But Tokefield, as a man, was evidently not inclined to great drama, because the court minutes, dated literally 2 weeks after the Great Fire, make absolutely no reference to the fact that the hall and its contents had been completely destroyed. It deals only with proceedings against the member for an infringement of a license. So perhaps things don't change. But again, you have to put your mind back into the people at the time. The whole area was razed to the ground.
Yeah.
And it wasn't unusual. Everybody was surveying the land, trying to prove what they owned.
This is it.
Yeah.
Everyone knew that there had
Yeah.
been a fire, so they
Yes.
didn't need to write it down.
I know.
And it's one of the things that can be quite frustrating about working with archives, because people don't bother to record things that seem that
Yeah.
obvious to them.
Yeah.
And so we
Yeah.
have to try and fit the pieces together with our
Yes.
relatively limited knowledge.
Yes.
But it's also what makes them fun to work with. So,
No, it really does. It really does. So we've drawn a picture for you by highlighting some of the main events and dates and people. So both whether it's online or in the hall, has anybody any questions or comments they would like to add to the discussion that we've had today? I think we have a microphone coming. In the third row on the my left.
Thank you very much. I understood that the building which now houses the Tokefield Centre was the oldest warehouse in the city, and I thought predated the fire, yet I don't see any mention of it anywhere on the plans that you reproduced in there. Can you tell me what its history has been?
and so it would have been the first part of the hall to be reconstructed after the fire. And in a sense, the actual hall where we are now came slightly later in the priorities of the company, because really the company needed to get back on its feet financially. Hence, the warehouses were prioritized. Things like businesses and houses that would draw an income were prioritized. And so the hall development came a few years after that.
Yes, the priority was given, wasn't it? I always understood, this is my tour guide talking, to the courtroom, because obviously all the warehouses have been lost and we needed that storage space. So that's why the site started to be developed from that end. And the hall, it seems surprising in a way that the hall, as such a token of the company, took 6 + 3, 9 years to 7 years to be opened. But that's because there was a lot of building work going on already on the site and in the area. Yeah, thank you. Any more questions? Yes, there's a question there.
A question for Julian. You mentioned about the 7 celestial balls shining in the heavens. Is that where the phrase seventh heaven came from?
Yes, absolutely, it is. Thank you. That's the sphere of Saturn, which is the last sphere before reaching God. And so the ancient Aristotelian cosmology was Earth at the center, which didn't move. And then there were 7, like Matryoshka dolls, they were all stacked together, 7 planets, which are the 7 days of the week also. So we have a movement of time we have in English, we have the Sunday, the Monday, Moon Day, we have Saturn Day. And these are all linked as a movement of time and space or recording time, hence almanacs. And the seventh heaven is the last celestial sphere before then getting closer to God. Dante talks about it in Book 3 of the Paradise. He takes the reader through the journey of the seven heavens. And once going past the seventh heaven, then you enter the realm of the primum mobile or the divine creator, which is God. And that is to be at one with the light of God. But the light is of extant from oneself, outside of oneself with God, is also the inner light of within, which is found on earth. So one connects to God through primum mobile. And to understand the movement of the planets through time is to get closer to God. Thank you.
Anything else from the panel?
I'll ask Ruth a daft question. So we won't be here for the 700th anniversary of the hall, sadly, in 350 years' time. But will they be able to see what we're doing now? What happens to present activity and archiving it? Because one reads in a way that, you know, modern technology and digitalization is a much cheaper way of preserving records. But of course, will they survive for 350 years as paper did? So will they be able to see what we're doing, Ruth, in 350 years' time?
Well, that's a very, very good question. And I think if there are any other archivists out there, they will join me in a kind of collective inward groan and maybe a prayer to the seventh heaven or otherwise. We hope so. We're working on it. Digital preservation is something of a nightmare. So, and interestingly enough, people now tend to be reverting to what were considered quite outdated methods of preservation. So in fact, there's a trend now to move digital content onto magnetic tape. We're very lucky here to have David Cordery from Max Communications, who I'm a bit nervous now about saying too much because I'm afraid he's going to correct me. But yes, we are working on it. It's a work in progress. It's also probably one of the most expensive undertakings for our archive, and it is going to increase the cost of preservation considerably. I would say watch this space, but let's just hope that in 350 years' time, there will be something for people to watch. Yeah, but thank you for the question.
It is amazing to think the invitation that Margaret focused on, 1681, that scrap of paper, why that scrap of paper, but that scrap of paper has survived. So whatever happens, there is so much modelling and paperwork that has been retained from the whole Vision 350 project.
Yeah.
But what Ruth's talking about is capturing it for that 350 years, which is the slightly uncertain element. Certainly fine for the next 50 years, I'm sure, in paper. We'll have to wait and see.
Giles.
Oh, have we a question from the back?
Just to, if I may, I'm Giles the clerk, just to reassure you that all the court orders are written down and kept in the archives.
Yes, they
for
are
future.
beautifully written down by a professional calligrapher. So we have a complete continuous run of court books. So that won't be going anywhere.
Yeah, very good point. Anything else from anybody? Well, I think I would just like to close the evening by going back to each of our panel members just to ask if they've got any closing reflections or points they would like to make from what they've heard from their fellow panel members, or any closing comment. Is there anything?
Ruth?
Well, actually, for me, putting the exhibition together has been so much fun. I was like a kid in a candy store. I was really just actually being able to spend the time looking through all the records again. Sadly, as an archivist, you get not as much time doing that as you'd like. So thank you to everybody for giving me that opportunity. And thank you also for telling me so much about the material.
David.
Well, long may venison dinners continue. I think is the theme that comes to mind. But no, seriously, my closing point about the importance of the company archive and how everything that we've talked about tonight demonstrates that and illustrates that is a really important thing to hang on to. And I think the question about ongoing modern records management, digitally and otherwise, I would echo, I agree is really important, but I know that you're on the case.
Paul?
Yeah, just reflecting on one interesting point, and that is that today we had 2 new freemen join the company from America. And if we go back a little bit further in the history of the way the company is organized and managed its premises, in 1611, there was, yes, you got another committee. And that was a smaller committee, and it was the committee that was tasked with looking at the Abergavenny Hall and arranging repairs, making it fit for purpose as the relatively new home of the stationers company. And if we look at the 4 people, there were only 4 people on that committee altogether. One, Humphrey Hooper, was an investor in the Virginia plantation. The second one, Richard Field, was the Stratford associate and first publisher of Shakespeare. The third one, George Swinnow, was investor in the Virginia plantation and a member of the Virginia Council in London. And Felix Kingston, the 4th and final member of that committee, was the official printer and publisher of the Virginia Company. So there is another connection between us, the hall, or at least the premises, and that part of the company that we're looking to expand into, a US connection.
Very interesting. Margaret?
No, I
Nothing to add.
Nothing to add, Julian.
Thank you. Well, I think that maybe in the 21st century, if the company was, say, to start getting a little bit more involved as a creative publishing of almanacs again, but maybe to go in line with the digital revolution, I think that would be a very interesting thing. But what I really think is the education is really important, because classical education, and the reason almanacs were so popular was because a classical education, people were taught about what was called the trivium and the quadrivium, which were the 3 ways and the 4 ways. And these equated to the 7 visible planets. And a good education meant that you understood the measurement of life through the planets. And this is what created great depth of knowledge, great understanding about life, and made Britain a very great country. And if there was that to be, some form of that to be reintroduced through education, then I think we could really find something very interesting. It's the government, even Rishi Sunak announced today, he wants to look at how to get maths taught to people to the age of 18. Well, I would like to suggest in the advisory group for the government, maybe the Stationers Education Committee could approach that advisory group and say, well, can we look at the trivium and quadrivium as a modern 21st century return to the classroom to invigorate pupils' passions? Because the passion is when they know about themselves. And if they get to find something about themselves, that ignites the passion. And you would have the whole country, the school children of the country, wanting to learn maths to 18 and beyond, if they could learn some foundational astrology with it. There you have it, folks.
Well,
Thank you.
So thank you very much for sharing this hour and a half with us. We hope you've enjoyed our scamper through the 350 years of history. It was impossible to do it justice, so we had to be selective, and hence the panel discussion tonight. But you have a much more scientific set of images in the timeline and the link to the website. My thanks have to go again to our wonderful members, Andrew Dicker, Justin Hobson and Jim Vaughan, who have helped us create this wonderful record, the future of the archive. To Ruth for organising the exhibition. I know she said it was fun. It's a lot of hard work. But the expert committee also helped pull the evening and the timeline together. And although I wasn't thinking ahead another 350 years, but I did wonder in what way will future members look back on 2023 for the 400th anniversary. I have to say, I'm not sure how many of us in this room will be there. I certainly won't be. But how many will gather together to share their recollections of that September 1666 and the 1673 reopening of the hall, and what we did this evening in London to celebrate this wonderful hall and its anniversary. So thank you very much on that note of history. Please do enjoy the rest of your evening and the discussion, and remember to raise a glass to the hall. Thank you very much indeed.